guess we won't wait for Eva anymore. She can come whenever she comes. All right. So let's begin with, since we all play guitar, we'll just use the guitar as the instrument to, because one of the things that I hate about music theory classes sometimes is that it's all abstract and then you don't get to hear what these things sound like. So yeah, so if we understand that an octave is a distance of 12 frets, right? If we know that from this F to this F, 12 frets higher, we have an octave. Well, now we have a visual representation of what that interval is, right? So let's start from intervals. So what's an interval? An interval is the distance between 2 points. And those 2 points being 2 notes. I have the lowest note in my interval. And then I have the highest note in my interval. That distance is an interval, and that's going to have a name. In this case, it's an octave. But it can also be called other things. I can have a second. I can have a third. I can have a fourth. A fifth. And those intervals can be played melodically like I'm doing. That means one note gets played and then the next note gets played. So I can have an ascending melodic fifth. I can have a descending melodic fifth. Or I can have a harmonic fifth. That's when the 2 notes get played at the same time. But all that is terminology. It doesn't really matter. It means you can play the notes one at a time, or you can play them together. That's all that means. So, how do we know what's a fifth, what's a second, what's a third? This cable's getting caught up over there. What's a third, what's a fifth, right? So if we take the musical alphabet, which we know it's A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then back to A, right? If we move from the first note to the second note, right? If we number everything, say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, right? So if we move from spot 1 to spot 2, we call that a second. If we move from spot 1 to spot 3, that's a third. From the first to the fourth spot is a what? A fourth, right? It gets pretty obvious after that. 6, 7, and then the octave. We don't call that an eighth. When you go from 1 to 8, that's an octave. It's that simple. Doesn't need to be complicated. If I go from spot 3 to spot 4, that's still a second. If I go from spot 3 to spot 5, that's still a third. So it doesn't have to be from here to here, to here, to here, to here. If I shift my positions over, the intervals names remain the same. Now, the way we organize music and a lot of musical concepts are based off of the major scale. The major key that has all natural notes is the key of C. By natural, I mean that there's no sharps or flats, right? So in the key of C, so all I have to do to turn this into a C major scale is reorganize these notes in such a way that the first note is C. Okay, so if we reorganize this, because we're going to talk about the major scale, so major scale, and now we have the same letter names, but now we're organizing them from C on. So we have C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. If we are to measure our intervals from the first note in a major scale, meaning all of my intervals are going to be from C to D, from C to E, from C to E, and so on. All of my intervals are going to be either major or perfect. If it's not perfect, it's major. The perfect intervals in a major key are going to be the fourth, the fifth, and the octave. Everything else is major.
What makes them perfect?
Perfect intervals are those which don't really have a variance. So with major intervals, or so-called imperfect intervals, you have a major version and a minor version. With perfect intervals, you only have the perfect interval, and that's it. If you begin to modify them, then you move into augmented or diminished territory, which, by the way, can also happen with the major and minor intervals, but you have to move past the major-minor kind of situation. And we'll look at that in more detail here in just a second. So, we said that the major intervals are going to be the perfect intervals. Perfect. Are going to be the fourth, the fifth, and the octave. I mean, you could argue that the unison is also a perfect interval, like if you play C to the same C, if you have the same pitch happening at the same time, like when you tune the guitar, that's a perfect interval as well. But nobody ever modifies. Like you don't see things like an augmented unison or a diminished unison. That's just done. So, in theory, yes, but in practical terms, it doesn't matter. And then we have our major intervals. Our major intervals is everything that's not the fourth, the fifth, or the octave, right? So what's that? That's the second, the third, the sixth, and the seventh, right? Those are my major intervals. Now that's important to know because if I modify, and now we're going to get to modifications, if I modify my major intervals by making them smaller, they turn minor. So the modifiers, the tools that we use to modify these natural notes are accidentals. And our accidentals are either the sharp, or the flat. So these people think sometimes, and this drives me crazy because they have almost like a piano-centric thinking in terms of music. So they think that designations like B flat are actual notes. That's incorrect. That's not true. The notes that land between the natural notes, like there's a note here, there's a note here, another one here, another one here, and another one there. Those notes don't have a name. They don't have a proper name. But we access them by using these modifiers. Okay? So what happens if you want to play this note? Well, you can say, hey, just take C and move it up a spot. Okay. So sharp means +1. So then flat means -1. I forgot to mention that. So okay, so C +1, that's C sharp. So C sharp just means take C and move it up a spot. If I say D flat, takes me to the same spot. And when I use one or the other, but this is true in equal temperament. We're not going to talk about temperaments because things get complicated when we do that. So we're going to assume that equal temperament is the truth, the absolute truth. And once we understand equal temperament and how music theory works in that, then we can look at alternative views in music. So this is true only in equal temperament. So in equal temperament, which is our universal truth at the moment, C sharp and D flat sound the same. So they are all this note right here, this note in the middle. The word that music theorists use to describe notes that are called different things but sound the same are enharmonic equivalents. You can remember that word or forget about it, doesn't matter. Why do I like thinking about accidentals this way as opposed to the conventional way of like, okay, A sharp / A flat is in between A and B. Why not do it that way? Since it seems easier. There's less mental math when you do it that way. Well, because that introduces some problems. For instance, if you take a intermediate piano student and you tell them to play E sharp, they're gonna stare at you blankly. They're gonna tell there's no E sharp. That note doesn't exist. And that comes from having that designation of these being fixed positions. But knowing what you know now, if I tell you to play E sharp, then that just means E plus 1. What's E plus 1? You'll be playing an F. You won't bat an eye at it. It's okay, well, it's a dumb way to design and designate an F, but I want to play an F. It makes sense to me, right? So that removes a lot of the things that cause confusion later. If you understand that these are just modifiers, and you can modify, you can move these notes into these spots in the middle, and you're basically moving them up the chromatic scale. The scale that includes all of the notes, these notes right here and the notes in the middle, it's called the chromatic scale. And that's where we use that. That's the smallest scale, the smallest interval that we can have in a note or in between notes in a scale. It includes all the notes. We use a 12-tone system in the West, and that's what's going to include all the notes. So now that we know that, we can modify the notes in the key of C. We modify our major intervals, right? We make them smaller. They're going to turn minor. So if we shrink a major interval by a semitone. What is a semitone? It's a fret. That's simple. By a semitone, it turns minor. Major, minor. We've heard those words before. So then the question is, well, what happens if you make it bigger? What happens if you take a major interval, because you can make it bigger, you can see, you can add. Well, now we get in trouble because then they become augmented. So if you make an interval major, if we increase, or let's say increase the size, of a major interval by a half step, or a semitone, or a fret, it turns augmented. And all kinds of crazy stuff happens when you start augmenting intervals. But then the other question might be like, well, now what happens if I take a minor interval and make it even smaller? It's going to turn diminished. So if we decrease a minor interval, we shrink a minor interval, it becomes diminished. I promise you there's a point to all these words. Now with perfect intervals, if you make them big, they turn augmented. If you make them small, they turn diminished. Okay? So, why is all this important? Well, because when we get to building chords, which we're going to do in just a little bit, the type of interval that we have is going to matter. And so, the sound of these intervals. So something like, let's say a third. So a third is the distance between the first and the third note of the major scale. So that's a major third. Right? If I make that an augmented third, it's going to sound like a fourth. Because So why am I calling it an augmented third and not a perfect fourth? Because I said the word E sharp instead of calling it an F.
It's the same thing.
It's the same thing, exactly. So for all intents and purposes, except for very niche, specific music theory situations when you're doing analysis, you just pick the enharmonic that makes the most sense. So if I see this, if I hear this sound, unless I'm compelled by the music or something that's written, the context, whatever, I am gonna label it as a perfect fourth. Just like I'm gonna call this an F note, not an E sharp note. But if you're working in college in some music theory class and the professor throws a curveball at you, then don't fall for that. If you see the E with the sharp, then you know, like, okay, it's an augmented third. They're gonna think that you're super smart because you figured it out, right? Okay, so that's where all that stuff that sometimes gets nebulous. It's like, oh, well, like in certain scales, like the melodic minor, we have this interval called the augmented second. It's like, oh, what the heck is an augmented second? It's just a second that you made bigger by one fret. Normally you play a major second like this, F to G, right? I'm thinking in A minor, so F to G, and now play F to G sharp. That's all I did. I just made it bigger by one fret. So all these scary things like, oh, augmented intervals, diminished intervals, all you did was you made it a little bigger, made it a little smaller. The simplest kind of chord that we have is the triad, right? So a triad, tri, 3, right? A triad is a 3-note chord. And they're built using the first, the third, and the fifth note in a scale. Since we started talking about the major scale, right? We're gonna use that. So in the case of C, the key of C is the easiest key because everything is natural. We're gonna have the first note, which is a C, the third note, which is an E, and the fifth note, which is a G. Right? C, E, G makes a major triad in the key of C. So that's major. So we have the root, the major third, and the perfect fifth. That's going to be important in a second. Now, the other type of triad that we have is the minor triad. The minor triad, all we're going to do is we're going to change the third to minor. So it's going to be the root, the minor third, and the perfect fifth. So the root, the minor third, and the perfect fifth. Just like that. That's it. Why is it called minor? Because the third is minor. The other type that we have is the diminished. The diminished triad, that's why I introduced that word earlier, so you guys don't get scared when you hear that chord. What's a diminished? What's it sound? It's if we take a minor chord and we diminish the fifth. So if we go C, E flat, and now we take that G and make it flat. So now we have the root, the minor third, and the diminished fifth. And then finally we have the augmented triad. The augmented triad it's going to be, if we take a major triad and we make that fifth and turn it augmented. So we go C, E, and G sharp. So that's going to be our root, the major third, and the augmented fifth. And right now, all those things are just words. They don't mean anything because you guys haven't heard the chords. So we're going here. C major, that's root, fifth, root, third. So that's C, G, C, C major, C minor, C diminished. So I'll take this G, turn it into G flat. See how tense that chord sounds. It wants to go somewhere. Someone like just sit there. This chord, you can sit on it, play all day, it sounds fine, nobody's gonna, but you know, here, you wanna sit there too long, people start getting mad. Then the augmented chord is the same as the major chord, but we take the G and make it sharp. So we end up with something like this. For some reason, in like movies and cartoons, they use this chord a lot for like dream sequences. I don't know why, but it has that sound. It has C augmented, that's what it sounds like. Okay, so now that we know what that sounds like, we know the intervals and everything and how that works. Now we're gonna take all this and move it around a little bit, because I mean it's cool that we can do it in C, but we need to be able to do this in for every note, right? So it's useful to know like how to make this work in every key. So if we were to take the major scale that we first used, which in the page that I just tabbed, yes, I can bring it back. Yes, I can. There, perfect. Okay. So if we use the same major scale and we look at the distance between each one of those notes, right? So we have here, from here to here, how many half steps do we have? From C to D. Don't forget the note in the middle. Two. Right? So we have two semitones or one whole tone, right? Or a half step, two whole steps. Right? Or rather, two half steps, one whole step. Right? The same thing is true here, from D to E. And then from E to F, though, there's no note in the middle. That's significant, because that means that there's only one semitone from E to F. That's why we have the whole E sharp debacle, right? There's only one half step in between. And then we continue, right? We have a whole, another whole, and another half. So we have whole, half, whole, half. Santa Claus. So that right there is the formula of the major scale. Whole, half, whole, half. Now, why is that important? Because if I reorganize the notes, and say, okay, now I want to play D major, right? And all I do is shift the note over, and I play from D to D, right? So we know that our C major scale is like this. Right? And then if all I do to play the D major scale is, okay, and I'm going to start on D and play the same notes. I go D, E, F, G, A, B, C, D. That no longer sounds like a major scale. Like something's missing. Right? And if I keep doing that, if I play it from E, it sounds like I'm playing C over and over and over again. Or, like I'm playing some kind of modal scale. But more than likely, your ears are going to pick it up as a C major scale starting on a different note. More so than the modes, because we are very well conditioned to hearing tonal music as tonal music, as opposed to just shifting the tonality from the lowest note. That's also why I take issue with how generally the modes get taught. So what do we need to do? Well, we need to keep this intervallic structure the same. We need to keep the formula the same. And how do we do that? Well, these guys right here. If we shift the notes around, now we can keep that same intervallic structure the same, no matter what note we start with. That's where key signatures come from. If you ever read standard notation, those of you who do, you know that at the beginning of the staff, sometimes you have like default sharps and default flats. You know from the Levitt book that you use. And if you don't read notation, just take my word for it. It happens. You have these sharps and flats that are used by default at the beginning of each line of music. And you do that so you don't have to write those accidentals over and over and over again to keep the integrity of the key the same. So, so when you do that, if you keep the inner valley structure the same, you're going to end up with 15 different keys. 15 keys, well, 7 keys on the sharp side, because you can have up to 7 notes that you are raising, right? Does that make sense? Yeah, C, D, E, so C sharp, D sharp, E sharp, right? All the way up until you sharp everything. And 7 keys on the flat side, because you can do the same thing with the flat side. And then you have the key of C that has no sharps or flats. So 15 different keys. 15 different major scales. But that's really interesting because we only have 12 tones, 12 notes. But we have 15 different keys. How does that work? How do we make that work? Well, remember when I was telling you guys about how dumb it is that we have like that you can call an F, an E sharp, right? Well, the same thing happens with keys. And it's not really dumb. I was being facetious. Because there are some situations, some musical situations where you do have to use those dumb notes, right? But so when you organize all the notes, and that's, if you've ever seen the circle of fifths wheel, right? Where you have like C at the center of the clock, right? You have C at the center, like, I'm gonna try to make a circle if I can. C, and then you have F on this side, and then you have G on this side, and then you have B flat over here, and then you have D over here, and then you have A over here, and then you have E flat over here, and then you have E, and then you have A flat, and then you have D flat over here, which can also be the key of C sharp, and then you have B over here, which can also be the key of C flat. And at the very bottom, at the 6 o'clock position, which my circle got all messed up, so it didn't work, you have your G flat / F sharp. What you're seeing here is a representation of what I just said. So this is all of the possible keys with the sharp keys on this side and the flat keys on this side, except, you know, where they overlap, right? So me personally, I don't really think in terms of like C flat and D flat. I mean, C flat and C sharp. I just kind of, unless I have to read the music in that key, if I'm writing it, I'm gonna write it in D. If I'm writing here, I'm gonna write in D flat. Like, there's no sense in making the people who are reading your music work harder, right? So you choose the keys, especially, again, since we're dealing with equal temperament. So this right here is all of the keys that are available in music. Now there's an additional hint that the circle of fifths gives you. If this position is 0 sharps, this next position is going to have one sharp, 1 flat, 2 sharps, 2 flats, 3 sharps, 3 flats, 4 sharps, 4 flats, 5, 6 flats at the very bottom. And then if you really want it, your 7 flats or 7 sharps are right here in the ones that overlap, right? So it's all there. Now these sharps appear for mnemonic purposes. Because again, a lot of these systems we just kind of like, we use and they don't really, I mean, the circle of fifths does have application in music, but there are a lot of concepts that appear in music that are not really necessary, that don't exist in in reality that we just use them as a way to make things easier to learn. And the order of sharps and the order of flats is one of those things. When you're dealing with sharp keys, the last sharp in the key signature is going to be the note right before the root, right before the tonic. That's a good way to remember that. So in the key of G, the last sharp, in the key of C, there's no sharps or flats. We already know that. In the key of G, the last sharp is going to be F. Nice, right before. So we have an F sharp. And there's only one sharp. So what's the only sharp in the key of G? F sharp. There's nothing else, right? Real easy. As you move down, you're going to include the sharps that you had before. So down here in the key of D, you have F sharp and C sharp. In the key of A, you have F sharp, C sharp, G sharp. Why? Because you just keep adding, you keep the one from before, and then you add the sharp that goes right before the note. So memorizing this shouldn't be really an issue because it's like right there, like the circle of fifths is telling you. And so many people struggle with that and they think like it's so hard, and it's not. It's really not. Then now when you get to the flats, I don't really have like an easy way to make that work, other than it's the same as the circle of fifths, but backwards. So the very last sharp is B, because my last key is C sharp, right? So the last sharp in that is going to include all 6 prior sharps, right? So we have F sharp, C sharp, G sharp, D sharp, A sharp, E sharp, and then we add the note before C sharp, which is B. So B sharp is the last sharp. Then we have all 7 sharps, all the notes are sharp. So when we are taking this key of F, the first flat is going to be B, because that was the last flat. Now the reason behind it all is because we want to keep the formula consistent and it all sound like the major scale. But that doesn't help us when we're trying to figure out the key. So a good way to remember is, okay, my last sharp is B, so the first flat is going to be B. And then as you move down, I just saw something. As you move down the circle of fourths, right? Because if you go this way is fifths, go this way is fourths. As you move down the circle of fourths, the very next key is up a fourth, which happens to be the last flat. So if you don't remember that B is the last sharp, you can just look at F and be like, okay, well, what's my next key? B flat, that's my last flat. So I have B flat. And then that's the only flat, so then you move on. So now you have B flat, and then what's my next key? E flat. Okay, so B flat and E flat. You have your entire key signature right there. And you can do the same thing and learn the key signatures the other way, the exact same way. And it makes it very easy. With that, you should be able to spell any major, of course, this is just one lecture, so after you learn all of this and you truly internalize it, you should be able to learn or to spell any major scale just given the first note, right? So if we're looking at, I don't know, the key of A flat, right? So we have, how many flats do we have in the key of A flat? So we have 1, 2, 3, 4. We have 4 flats. What's the last flat? Well, the next key, so a D flat. What are the flats? The other flats are included. Well, we have B flat, E flat, A flat, D flat. And then we can spell the entire scale. So it's going to be A flat, B flat, C natural, D flat, F, G natural, A flat. More back then. Very easily we can spell major scales that way. So if we can spell any major scale, then we can build any major chord that we want, right? So if I ask you guys, like, what does the E chord include? Right? What notes are in the E chord? Well, we know that is the first, the third, and the fifth note of the E major scale. Okay, so we know that is some kind of E, some kind of G, and some kind of B. And then all you have to figure out now is like, okay, where are my sharps in the key of E? Because I know that E is a sharp key, right? So how many sharps do we have? 4, right, in the key of E. So which are those sharps? We have F sharp, C sharp, G sharp, and D sharp. The G was sharp, so that means that the triad is spelled E, G sharp, B. Just like that, 1, 3, 5. And if you know the major triad, then you can also modify it and turn it into any one of these chords that you want. So if we take that same example and just write it, right? So we have E, G sharp, and B. And then to make it minor, we just take this G and make it natural, right? It was sharp before, we lowered it by a half step. So then we have E, G natural, and B. To make it diminished, we take that B and we lower it, so it's going to be flat. So diminished, E, G natural, B flat. There's a B, not an R. And to make it augmented, this one's going to get down because we have E, G sharp, and B sharp. Why not C? Why not just call it C instead of B sharp? Because now it matters. Because in order for me to call this the fifth of the chord, it has to be some type of B. It has to be. There's no other way. So if I name this C, now I'm looking at something else. Even though it'll sound the exact same, in analysis it's not going to work. Because now you're looking at a minor sixth as opposed to a augmented fifth. So, and the more complex our chords get, the more these right now seemingly technicalities that we're just splitting hairs. Like why are you being like that about chord names and tone names? Like it shouldn't matter. But as you deal with bigger and bigger chords and more complex chord movements and harmonies, then these seemingly insignificant concepts from the beginning come into play. Because if you're nebulous about it, things get extremely confusing as your chords get bigger. So that's why it's important that we understand. Basically, there is some kind of B, because B is 5, right? E, F, G, A, B. I can't take C because C is a 6. So it has to be a B. Yeah, but is that not up there? Okay, well then we gotta call it a B sharp. We gotta call it that. There's no getting out of calling it that. Now let's look at how these triads, these chords, fit in a major key. So we're going to go back to the safety and the joy of the key of C. So we don't have to worry about sharps and flats. I just wanted to show you guys that the other keys, they're not scary. We can learn them the same way. But I still like explaining things in the key of C, especially because the guitar is so easy to transpose everything. We can learn everything in C and just move it around. It's no big deal. Okay, so in the key of C, can you guys see down here if I write? Is it visible? Mm-hmm. Okay. I don't want to waste paper. So in the key of C, if I write the scale and I go C, D, E, F, G, A, B, right? And then I stack thirds, right? So I basically go every other note on top of each one of these notes, right? So then I have C, E, G, and then above D I have F and A. Above E I have G and B. Then I have A and C above F, B and D above G, C and E above A, D and F above B. You're gonna find that these chords, and I'll play them for you so you can hear, they are not all going to be major. I mean, the first will be, if I play C, that's major, because I'm in the key of C major. But when I move up to the key of D, or not to the key of D, to the chord, I play my D note, and build that chord from there, I'll just play it like this. Now I'm going to have a minor chord. See the sound? If I transpose it down, we're back to that triad that we talked about earlier. So major is the first chord. The second chord is minor. The third chord is also minor. The fourth chord is major. See that one too. The fifth chord is major. And the sixth chord is minor. The seventh chord is diminished. And then I'm back to major. So I'm back to 1. So, why is that? Well, because as we saw when we built the scale, the distance, the intervallic structure of the scale is not regular. We're not dealing with a symmetrical scale. So because of that, the distance between each individual note of the major scale is not necessarily that of a major third or a perfect fifth. The size of those intervals is going to change because of the distance between B and C and E and F, right? So the first chord is major. The second chord ends up being minor because in the key of D, F should be sharp. It's 2 sharps. And the second, right? Remember, there was F sharp, so F sharp and C sharp. So these D should be sharp if we want a major chord. But in the key of C, we don't have F sharp, we have F. So that chord is minor naturally. The same thing is true with E because if just by looking at the example, notice that it's minor. You heard it, but just proving my word. So then over here, F, A, C, we have a major chord. Because in the key of F, we just have a F major. We have just a B flat, doesn't affect the triad. So we are building straight out of the major scale, the 1, 3, 5 in F major, and the 4, 6, 1 in the key of C kind of line up the same. So we have a major chord there. Same thing with our 5. G, B, and D fits our G major key, so it's a major triad. And then A, it's minor, because that's going to include the C sharp from over here, and we're taking it away. And then B is all kinds of messed up, because like that one is way down here, right? So we know that a lot of it is sharp, and none of the notes that should be sharp are sharp. So that's why that chord is diminished. Now I'm oversimplifying. We could be talking about the exact size of intervals and how, like the write out a table about how each interval has a specific measured distance. And if we had a full semester to cover this material, I probably would do that and like explain that stuff. But right now I'm trying to kind of make this as practical as possible so you can translate it to your instrument, and leaving out some of that technical knowledge is a compromise that we have to make. If we number, which we should, number the chords. You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. You're going to see a very familiar scheme of Roman numerals, and I'm sure you've heard things like play a 1-4-5 in the key of G, or play a 2-5-1 in B, right? B flat. So when people refer to chord progressions that way, they're talking about this numeral system. Now, why this? Because this chord scheme is going to repeat no matter what key. If I plug in a different key in here, if I write, okay, let's do it in E flat, let's do it in B flat, or A, or E, any major key, the quality of the chords, the notes are going to change, obviously, because the key changed, right? But the quality of the chords is going to be the same. 1 will always be major, 2 will always be minor, 3 will always be minor, and so on. So something good to remember is that in a major key, 1, 4, and 5 are going to be major triads. 7 is going to be a diminished triad, and everything else is minor. And then, just with that knowledge, you can take your guitar and select the chords that are going to fit in whatever key you want. You can write off the diminished chord because, like, you're probably not going to use it. So you end up with 6. If you're playing triads only, you're probably not going to use a diminished chord. So that leaves you with 6 usable chords that you can use in any key, right? So that's the main takeaway of all of this is you can take those chords and begin to apply what you learn, like this music theory material, to your own practice. Music theory shouldn't be sterile, just like, oh, it's a bunch of letters and stuff and looks like math and I don't get any of it. No, like, you guys need to hear it. It needs to be part of your practice. When you're playing your guitar, try to understand why the chords sound the way they do, why they work together. And you might discover something. Sometimes you may come in with a question and be like, well, how come in C major, I'm playing C major, but I play this A flat major chord and it sounded awesome? Like, why does it work? Is something wrong with my ear? I don't, like, what's wrong with it, right? And so then you begin to find these little exceptions, right? Because these rules that we learn in the beginning, it's just like fundamentals. And a lot of people don't get past this. There's so much more, guys. I just don't have time to cover it all. There's so much more. But it's all a justification as to why stuff sounds good. All of it. Secondary dominants and borrowed chords and whatever you guys see, like, it sounds all fancy and esoterical. The thing that I've always said, and I think I even made a video about this, is that music theory is not this magical grimoire that makes you like a better musician. It's forensic explanation. You are looking at written music and saying like, oh, this sounds good. This is why it sounds good. It doesn't teach you how to preemptively do stuff. It explains why stuff that shouldn't sound good sounds good. And then, the fundamental stuff is all the vanilla stuff. It's all like real, like simple. It's like, oh, these are the chords that go good together. And this is all the inside sounds and everything else. But as you get further and further along, those are the explanations as to why the exceptions of these basic rules that we learned in the beginning sound good. We haven't even covered minor tonalities. That's like a whole other world. The minor key is a completely different world with variations. We have 3 different scales instead of just 1. And then that adds variance to the chords. Because instead of having like a single 5 chord, you have different variations of the 5 chord. You have non-functional harmony, and then meaning chords that behave in the way that you expect them to behave. And then you have chords that don't behave that way. So there's one more thing I want to cover if I have time. Don't really have time, but I'm still going to do it. Okay, one last thing. There you go. Okay. So, if we add an extra note to our triads and we play with 4 note chords, right? And we add an extra note two or three note chords, right? So before we had C, E, G, right? And then we move that up the scale and we have D, F, A, E, G, B, F, A, C, G, B, D, A, C, E, and B, D, F, right? We add one extra note, so that's a third above that. Right? Tertian harmony means that we keep stacking thirds. It's just a fancy way of saying we're going every other note. Right? And we could do that until we run out of notes in the major scale, but we're not going to cover that. That'll be too much. So we are going to add one more. So that is going to be the seventh. Why? Because if we go 1, we skip 2 and we take 5. 3, sorry, can't count. We skip 4 and then take 5. We skip 6 and we take 7. So then the basic makeup of a 4-note chord in tertian harmony is going to be 1, 3, 5, 7. And that's where the dreaded 7 chords come from. So if I do that, right, so I add a B and then I add a C, then I add a D, and then above that I add E, an F, a G, and an A. And I end up with this giant block of chords. There are different types of 7th chords as well, just as we have different types of triads. Because what happens, first of all, the 7th, as we saw in the beginning, was a major interval, right? In the major scale, C to B is a major 7th. That means that there has to be a minor variation, so we can have a minor 7th. So what possible combinations do we have? Well, we can have a major triad with a major 7th on top, a minor triad with a minor 7th on top, a major triad with a minor 7th on top, and a minor triad with a major 7th on top, right? And of course I can add some of the other variations, take some of the other triads and have like an augmented triad with a major 7 on top or a minor 7 on top, and take a diminished triad and add a minor 7 or a major 7 on top of it. But we're not going to look at those because they don't tend to happen in a major tonality. That's all we're looking at right now is major keys, right? So if we stack this and we look at the different types of chords that we end up with, you're going to see that we're going to end up with a major 7 here, a minor 7 here, another minor 7 here, another major 7 here, a dominant 7 here, a minor 7 here, and a half diminished 7 here. Now, why all of this? We'll have to analyze each chord individually, right? So major 7 is self-explanatory. All the notes fit the notes in our major key, which means that we have a major 3rd, a perfect 5th, and a major 7th. So it's a major 7 chord. That's the sound. And the sound of it is like this. So C major 7. That's the sound. That's the under the bridge chord. Right. C major 7. The next chord is going to be a minor 7 chord. Why? Well, it's a minor chord. And I'm going to have to pull the page where all the circle of fifths are and everything. But basically, we have a C natural, which in the key of D should be sharp. And we have an F natural, which in the key of D should also be sharp. So we have both a minor 3rd and a minor 7th, along with a perfect 5th, which gives us a minor 7. Then we have another one of those in the key of E. Well, not the key of E. with an E root note, so it's an E minor 7. Then we have a major 7 in F. Or if you want to keep the, if you want to hear the A, you want to hear the A. Now, so that's self-explanatory too. That fits our major key, no big deal. Now, this is where things get kind of weird. What does this 7 mean? Well, here we have an interesting situation because GBD makes a G major triad. But if you guys remember from the circle of fifths, right, G only has one sharp, and that sharp happens to be F. Well, F in this case is natural. So now we have a major chord, a major triad, with a minor 7th on top. That's what we call a dominant 7th chord. A dominant 7th chord is a major triad with a minor 7th on top. That's it. And that's the sound. That's a bluesy sounding chord. So, a lot of times when people learn 7th chords, especially on guitar, they learn dominant 7 chords only. They learn like C7, A7, G7, and so on. And they think like, oh, those are the 7th chords. Well, yes, but there's more, right? You can take those same chords and instead of C7, you play C major 7. And that's a different sound, right? Because now the major 7th versus that minor 7th makes a pretty big difference in the flavor of the chord. The color of the chord is completely different, right? So that happens to be in the 5th position, not physically, but in the scale, the 5th note, right? G7, that's a 5. It's a dominant chord. That's important because dominant chords tend to resolve, and that's harmony. I'm getting ahead of myself. Dominant chords tend to resolve a perfect 4th up. And that's because the 5 wants to go to the 1. But we're not going to talk about that anymore. That's all I'm going to say. Okay, so then the 6th is going to be our A minor. So that's here. A minor 7, or like this. So another minor chord. Because once again we have in the key of A, we should have a C sharp and a G sharp, and both are natural. So we end up with minor 3rd, minor 7th, with a perfect 5th, which is going to give us a minor 7. Now, things get interesting again with this B chord, because now not only is the 3rd different from the one that we expect to find in the major scale, and the 5th different, but also our 7th note is going to be different. So that creates a problem because we have a diminished triad, we have a minor 7 chord on top. So the designation that we give a chord like that, a diminished triad with a minor 7th on top, is a half diminished chord, or what I prefer because it's more descriptive, minor 7 flat 5. Minor 7 flat 5 literally tells you what the chord is. It's a minor 7 chord with a flatted 5th. So that's the sound of it. Flat 5, minor 7th. So those are the chords that are going to show up in every major key. So 1 and 4 are going to be major 7 chords. 5 is a dominant 7 chord. 7 is a half diminished chord. Everything else is minor. So if I use the chord symbols here, we're going to have C major 7, D minor 7, E minor 7, F major 7, G7, A minor 7, and B minor 7 flat 5. So if you have a chord book and stuff, you can look up those chords and then play around with them. And just like before, if you plug in a different key, a different scale, and build a different key, because like the difference between a key and a scale, the simplest definition I can come up with is that a scale is a set of notes. So you have individual tones that you're playing around. That's a scale. A key is a set of chords. Yeah, there are rules that affect tonality, But if we look at it in the simplest possible way, yeah, the rules are included in how the chords move. So you can just say that a key is a set of chords, and then go from there. So in the key of C major, these are the chords that I'm going to have. Now, the type of chord that I'm going to have in each position, and again, I'm not talking about physical position, but I'm talking about the placement in the scale. Is it on the first note, on the second note, on the third note, and so on? It's going to remain constant in any major key that you choose. So if we change the key to the key of B, then we're going to have a B major 7, a C sharp minor 7, a D sharp minor 7, a G major 7, an E major 7, sorry, an F sharp 7, a G sharp minor 7, and an A sharp minor 7 flat 5. So no matter what key you pick, these chord types are all going to work. And that's why people use the Roman numerals, because it's a lot easier to say 5 than to say F sharp 7. It's more words. So it's a lot easier to say play the 5, especially if you already know what key you're in. So musicians across the board have used this Roman numeral system, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, to communicate specific chord types based on the tonality that they're in. And that is all I got for you guys today.